In this lesson, we are going to continue to learn about South Carolina's shift from a proprietary to a royal government. In the last lesson, we basically learned that the Carolina colonies changed from the control of the proprietors to the control of the king. This began because both the proprietors and the common people started to be unhappy with each other and the situation that was going on in the Carolinas. The proprietors were angry at the colonists because they felt they were being disobedient and that they were making very little profits. Now, the colonists were angry at the proprietors because they felt they were absentee landlords collecting rent but offering no protection. In the end, the king is tired of hearing about this and decides that it would be just best for everybody if he pays off the proprietors and South Carolina becomes royal. Now, when he does this, the government of the Carolinas changes slightly. The Grand Council becomes the General Assembly, and the king appoints the governor. But the governor's power was limited because the General Assembly controlled his taxes. Perhaps most important is the economic benefit that the Carolinas received because of this. Because of this, they started to receive subsidies or extra payments for naval stores. And another direct economic benefit was rice that was on the enumerated list could now be sold directly to foreign countries. Another benefit, which is not quite economic, was townships were created in the backcountry, which paved the way for the settlement of the backcountry by beginning the establishment of government there. These townships attracted subsistence farmers. One of the important topics that we talked about was that there was a disproportionate number of representatives from the Low Country in the Grand Council. Even though the Low Country had less people, this is where all the political and economic elite plantation owners were, and they had more power in the government. They had more representatives than the backcountry, even though the backcountry's population was growing to exceed the Low Country. Now, in this lesson, we are going to review some of the early government of the Carolinas and learn about the differences between the backcountry, upcountry, and low country, and learn about when the citizens of the backcountry had to take the law into their own hands. So before we get to that, we're going to talk about the early government in the Carolinas, the Grand Council, the legislative group like the House of Burgesses in Virginia, the group that gave the colonists a voice in their government. Well, the Grand Council, although it was primarily made up of the elite and representatives of the proprietors, they believed everyone should have a voice in the government. And this results in the founding of the House of Commons in the Grand Council. Now, the Grand Council's purpose was to make laws and to make tax laws. as well as other laws. Now, representation, of course, this being the Grand Council, this being when the colony of Carolina was controlled by the proprietors, most of the representation was in the hands of the proprietors and the elite. However, recognizing that everyone should have a voice in the government, they created the House of Commons to give the common people representation in their government as well. Now, the Grand Council, like all other early governments and ours today, it was a two-house government called a bicameral legislature. Now today, the U.S. government, as well as all state governments, they are bicameral. Does anybody know the two parts of our national legislature? We're going to learn about them in future, but they are the House of Representatives and it begins with an S, yes, the Senate. So today, we also have a bicameral legislature, as did the early governments. Now, it's important because having a bicameral legislature means that not just one group can pass laws. Both houses had to have a majority agree to pass those laws. So, the South Carolina early government consisted of a governor, and the Grand Council. After it became royal, it would still have a governor, but the Grand Council's name would change to the General Assembly. Now, of course, the early government was based in Charlestown, the capital city. Now, as the Carolina colony evolved, there became a definite difference between the back country and the low country. Because in the low country, which was the area surrounding Charlestown, you had wealthy planters like this guy. These wealthy planters, their families came over and they received land with the headright method. They may have bought more slaves and received more. And these wealthy planters, they have grown rich from exporting rice and indigo. I refer to these wealthy planters as Mr. Headright because headright method led to the establishment of large plantations. Now in the back country, things happened differently. There were not large plantations. The back country was made largely up of people like this fur trapper, who I like to name Woodsman Jack, or this farmer. They are not rich. They do not have enormous houses like Mr. Headright over here. And in some ways, the rich in Charlestown look down upon the farmers and the woodsmen in the back country. As was said before, the legislature in Charleston, which would become the General Assembly after the switch from proprietary to royal, the Low Country had more members. Let's pretend they have 100 members. The Low Country had 70, while the Back Country would have 30. This gave the Low Country more political power. Now, why this is very disproportionate is because the Back Country started to have more people, perhaps 50,000 to 20,000. So the Low Country is where the political power rested. It's where the elite plantation owners were. They were rich from exporting. It's where the plantations were. And it's where most of the slaves were, because slaves were such expensive, valuable property. The only ones that could afford them mainly were those that inherited them or were very wealthy, like Mr. Headright, living in his big plantation. And, of course, this is where most of the political power was. So pretty much what the rich elite living in Charlestown or on its outskirts wanted, they got because they had the most political representation. Now the difference is in the Back Country, and it's more than just economics. It's also government and societal differences. In the Back Country, the people were pretty much left to fend for themselves. There were no courts or law. So criminals may go unpunished. Of course, we've talked about many times, the common people, especially those in the Back Country, had less political representation. They were people like Woodsman Jack and our farmer here, traders and woodsmen, and our subsistence farmers. Which subsistence farmers are different than wealthy planters like Mr. Headright here. Subsistence farmers only grow what they needed to support their family. Now, these people, Woodsman Jack and our farmer, they were viewed as uncivilized by the Low Country, who felt they were better than them. Also, it wasn't limited to English colonists. Also, there was a more diversity in the Back Country because Irish and German immigrants started to move here. And even though the Back Country outnumbered the Low Country, there was still not equal political representation. So, to repeat what was just said, now this societal difference started to cause problems, which obviously the settlers of the Back Country didn't like being called or viewed as uncivilized. Now, the Low Country felt they were better because they were from the area surrounding the city of Charlestown. They owned the big plantations and they were the rich. Now, Charleston grew because, of course, this is where rice and indigo were grown on the plantations. Now, eventually, some coastal settlers moved inland, and Scotch, Irish, and Germans came from Pennsylvania, and it causes the Back Country to outnumber the Low Country. But, as was said many times before, the backcountry still did not have equal representation. Remember, the low country had a disproportionate number of representatives. Even though there were more people in the backcountry, the area painted green, there were fewer people representing them. The low country, where the rich plantation owners are, like Mr. Headright, had the majority of representatives. Now, also, leading into the next part of the lesson, the backcountry had no law enforcement. So, those that lived there took the regulation of society into their own hands. There were criminals that were robbing people and murdering, and there were other problems. The people of the backcountry had to do something to take control, and what they started was the regulator movement. The regulator movement would be the citizens of the backcountry form vigilante groups, and they go out and punish criminals. This is what we're going to learn about next. So, the regulator movement occurs in the backcountry of the Carolinas. The regulators, they were like police, but they were not official. They were just citizens who were sick of being taken advantage of by criminals who had nothing to fear because there was no law. The backcountry had no courts or law, and criminals were taking advantage of the honest people. So, some groups of people form vigilante groups. These vigilante groups took the law into their own hands. And they punished, tracked down, and would kill, in some cases, these criminals who were killing others. They practiced the law through self-regulation. However, there were some problems with the practice of the regulators. And one of these problems is they started to become lawless themselves. And they abused their power. Now, another problem was more official, even though the people that they were punishing were most of the time guilty. They were denied their rights as English citizens that were set forth, that were started by the Magna Carta, and also continued by English common law, where these guilty that were hanged or beaten to death by the regulators, and many were probably deserving. However, they were denied their right as Englishmen to a trial by their peers. And a trial by their peers would be called what? Yes, a jury trial. Well, eventually, the regulator movement ends. There's actually a fight between the king's men, the army, and the regulators that happened between North Carolina and South Carolina. I believe it started in South Carolina, and the king's army followed the regulators into North Carolina, and they were defeated. But in the end, South Carolina helps out by setting up 7 circuit courts. And with these circuit courts, this would be the beginning of bringing justice, law, and order to the backcountry. So, one of the effects of the regulator movement was the establishment of these 7 circuit courts in the backcountry to help paved the way for justice and police protection in the backcountry. So, here's the regulators again, vigilantes who took the law into their own hands. To go through the PowerPoint about the regulator movement, since there were no courts, regulators operate as vigilantes because there were criminals taking advantage and there was a need. They provided law and order through self-regulation, but they turned lawless themselves and turned into like a gang. One of the problems, even though the guilty that were hanged or beaten to death probably were, in fact, bad and deserved such a fate, they were punished without a jury trial, which violated English people's rights. In the end, one of the main effect of the regulator movement is 7 circuit courthouses were set up to provide justice, law, and order. The backcountry still did not get even representation as the low country, which continued the problems between the two. So, one effect of the regulator movement was the establishment of 7 circuit courthouses set up in the backcountry. Here's a couple courthouses. I believe that one's in Charleston, which is actually the low country. But in the backcountry, there were 7 circuit courthouses set up, which would pave the way for justice, law, and order, and help protect those citizens in the backcountry. This is all for the lesson today. Thank you for listening. I hope you did well.